In the late 80s, Gary Gygax, creator of Dungeons & Dragons and co-founder of TSR, was effectively removed from the company. With new management in charge, TSR announced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, which was released in 1989. Nobody was aware of the big plans TSR had for Dungeons & Dragons, and they had big plans. In 1990, TSR began unleashing their product Onslaught. Books, board games, video games, and much more were released to the public, including several new campaign settings, one of which was Ravenloft. I just happened to see the Ravenloft box set sitting on a shelf of my local bookstore, and it caught my eye. Having not played D&D for the last few years, I had no clue what this was. Was it a sequel to I6, a reprint, or a remake, or something entirely new? Well, I took a risk, paid my $25 and bought it. Got home, opened that block box, and have never been the same since. For those who don't know, I will give a brief synopsis of what Ravenloft is. A land surrounded by mists located in an ethereal plane. There is a core landmass with many domains, a lot like the United States, and every state is a domain. Every domain is ruled by a Dark Lord who is totally evil. Each Dark Lord is cursed. They cannot leave their domain, and they have some greatest desire they yearn for but can never have. They are also extremely powerful and can close the borders of their domains at will, preventing people from leaving or from entering. Some Dark Lords rule their domain with an iron fist, the citizens of the domain knowing full well what kind of monster their Dark Lord is, and they live in absolute terror. Some Dark Lords rule with a soft hand, the people not knowing what kind of monster their Lord truly is. And some Dark Lords are totally unknown by the people of the land and have no interest in ruling. Some domains are small, some are large, some sparsely populated, some densely populated. Many different cultures and climates are represented by these domains, everything from ancient Egypt to Victorian London. These domains are based on classic literature, movie, folklores, and myth, but all of the horror variety. The Mists of Ravenloft draw in adventurers from other campaign settings, and once in, they rarely leave. Death usually gets them first. You see, the undead and other monsters are much more powerful in Ravenloft. Many magical spells the heroes rely on work differently, if they work at all. Fear and horror are everywhere, dark curses plague the land, and woe to those who commit acts of evil, for the mist will take them and never let them go. It was a brilliant concept and a fantastic idea for a Gothic campaign setting. I fell in love with it instantly, and my imagination ran wild with the possibilities of all the grand adventures me and my friends would have. From that day forward, Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting I would play would be exclusively Ravenloft. And barring a few instances here and there to placate a few friends of mine, that has been true to this day. In fact, I made it a point to get every Ravenloft product released when it was released, and with one or two exceptions, I kept true to that. The Ravenloft core set black box contained a 137-page rulebook written by Bruce Nesmith and Andrea Hayday, with cover art by Clyde Caldwell and interior art by Stephen Fabian. And they did one hell of a job establishing the mood and atmosphere of the world of Ravenloft. It contained 4 full-size poster maps and 25 cover-size location cards and family portraits. The rulebook, divided into many chapters, went like this. Chapter 1 from Gothic Roots goes over the inspiration for creating the Ravenloft campaign setting, mostly the classic literature and the classic monsters, mainly the universal ones, of that era. Chapter 2, the Demiplane of Dread, goes over the growth and overall history of the land of Ravenloft, and I was excited to see that Strahd von Zarovich and his domain of Barovia were included. This goes over how the Demiplane was formed, how Barovia was at one point in time the only domain of Ravenloft, and how the adventure in the first Ravenloft module, I6, took place, but in canon timeline, the adventurers were killed and did not defeat Strahd. And then eventually, I-10, Ravenloft 2, the House on Griffin Hill, took place, and Strahd somehow ended up in the domain of Morden. With that inclusion, Morden became a domain in the Demiplane of Dread. However, once Strahd left Morden and went back into Barovia, And they never really go over what happened in Ravenloft 2. They just mention it as to give a reason as to why Mordant is in the Demiplane of Dread. Mordant became a permanent domain with Lord Godfrey now the leader of the domain. Azelin would end up walking into the mist and becoming a lord of his own domain of Darkon. And then slowly but surely other domains formed and joined with the core, and then that is what we have today, a big core of domains, with certain islands of terror also floating in the mist. One notable domain is Sithicus, which contains the Dark Lord, Lord Soth from the Dragonlance campaign. This was a big controversy at the time because many people, Dragonlance fans, thought Soth should have stayed in Dragonlance because Weiss and Hickman, the co-writers of the Dragonlance books, were not with the company at that time, so TSR thought they can do what they pleased with the property from the Dragonlance saga. However, this would later on be changed, and Soth would eventually make his way back to Dragonlance, but for a long period of time he was in Ravenloft. Chapter 3, The Reshaping of Characters, goes over how the character classes are different in Ravenloft, and how non-human races are thought of not good, and they're very few, and goes over power checks. Power checks are die rolls a player would make if his character ever did an act of evil, and they better hope they don't fail it, because if they did, they would slowly become embraced by the mist, gain powers, but also gain curses, and slowly and surely become evil, and will eventually turn full evil and be under the control of the Dungeon Master. Chapter 4, Fear and Horror Checks, goes over the new game mechanics of Fear and Horror in Ravenloft. It answers when and where to use them and what happens if players fail the checks. Fear and Horror checks are basically a good mechanic that do add to the mood and atmosphere of Ravenloft. The trick to using Fear and Horror is not to overuse them. A good instance of using a horror check would be if a player saw one of his fellow player characters or a prominent NPC that they have known for a long time get killed by a villain very brutally right in front of him. That would constitute a horror check. And there are certain times to use them. Fear checks are more common, whereas player goes up against something they've never gone up against before or something they know they have no chance of defeating. There are many possibilities of what could happen if they failed that fear check, including dropping their items and running away, cowering terror, gaining a phobia, those sorts of things. While fear checks last somewhat a short length of time, horror checks last very long and stay with the character during the course of their campaign. Chapter 5, Werebeasts and Vampires, explains how the vampires and werebeasts of Ravenloft are very different from the other settings. Basically, they're more overpowered. There are many different varieties of them, and the lycanthropy curse cannot be easily gotten rid of, and you cannot have vampire or werewolf players. This would later be expanded on in future products to even add more variety to the setting. Chapter 6, Curses, explains how curses operate in Ravenloft and where to use them. Curses are a very powerful thing in Ravenloft, and for the most part you don't want anything to do with them. You could actually give a curse, but it does take a toll on you, as well as receive a curse, which can be the basis for a campaign as to try to remove the curse or somehow stem it. Curses can come in very different varieties, minor or major, and are not exclusively but mostly limited to the gypsies giving them out. Chapter 7 details the gypsies, the nomadic people who wander the realm of Ravenloft and the mysterious powers they have. Otherwise known as the Vistanti, they can travel the mist, they can dole out curses, they can tell fortunes, and have a unique power and place in the realm of Ravenloft. Outcasts and not well liked by most people of the domain of Ravenloft. Some domain lords outright can't stand them, while some tolerate them. They go by their own set of rules and make an interesting variation to the demiplane. However, their inclusion in many adventure modules would kind of water it down a little bit, but that was still some time yet to come. Chapter 8, Telling the Future, borrows from the i6 Ravenloft module, the Fortunes of Ravenloft mechanic, and expands upon it, and gives players ways to do authentic fortune telling sessions with player cards, dice, various other items and such. It tells you when to do it, how to do it, where to do it, and a way to add mood and flavor to doing it. Chapter 9, Spells in Ravenloft, goes over which spells in Ravenloft just plain out won't work and which ones are changed and their effects. Most of the spells that won't work have to do with detecting good and evil, teleportation through domain borders, leaving the misty plane, those type of things. However, these do include wizard and priest spells, and the best way to do it is to let the players who rely on spells so much to cast it and for the first time see how the spell is altered. I find that very interesting to do that, and it does work rather well. Chapter 10, Magical Items in Ravenloft, basically goes over the same thing but with magical items. Chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14 I'm going to skip over because these are the 4 chapters that I have a problem with in this book, and I'll explain upon that later. Chapter 15, Techniques of Terror, gives Dungeon Masters tips and tricks on how to run a Ravenloft campaign. Basically how to set up mood and atmosphere, tension, that kind of stuff, and it's pretty helpful. Chapter 15, Techniques of Terror, and Chapter 16 are basically the same. Chapter 16 is adventure ideas, and it just basically gives it DMs hooks, little ideas based off of classical literature and stuff like that, and folklores and tales on how to run some good adventures. And then you have the appendix at the end, which has several new Ravenloft monsters, which are all pretty decent, and some are even brought back from the first edition, like the Strawhide skeletons and Strawhide zombies and such like that. Now, chapter 14, one of my unfavorable chapters I'm going to take first, and it's called Bloodlines, and it's basically a bunch of charts detailing family trees of important families of Ravenloft. There are several pages dedicated to this, and really this should not have been in the book. Other things should have been in here instead of this. It's basically useless information that you don't really need. That's just basically it, and it takes up several pages, and something else could have been done with that extra pages. And what I suggest that something else been done was add to chapter 11, Lands of the Core. It goes over the domains of the core continent of Ravenloft. Some of these domains are detailed, but many of them are just a couple sentences written about them that give very little details on the domain lord and the land itself. Chapter 12, Islands of Terror, describes several of the islands in the mist, and again the same problem. There are a few that are detailed okay, but many of them just have 1 or 2 sentences description about them, and they don't really give you any information about the domain lords and their people. And I feel that Bloodlines chapter could have been used to beef these 2 chapters up, because many of it feels like half-baked ideas or stuff they didn't know what they were doing with yet. Hey, let's put this in here right now. We're not exactly sure about it. We'll come back in a future product and give it more detail. But for now, let's just write this in. As a matter of fact, they didn't even have the domain lords for a few of the domains. They just left it up in the air as to who they were. That really infuriated me, because these 2 chapters, Lands of the Core and the Islands of Terror, are 2 of the best, most interesting chapters in the book. I liked reading about those domains. I found them very interesting. And those domains are what the backbone of Ravenloft, and they bring a lot of atmosphere and mood to the setting. And it was just such a disappointment that they couldn't detail all of the domains. I know there's a lot of them, and I know they would be hard pressed to do so, but still I found it very frustrating, and to me that is one of the weak points of the book. To a lesser extent, chapter 13, The Who's Doomed of Ravenloft, basically gives background on some of the Dark Lords of Ravenloft and some other very prominent NPCs dwelling within the land. While the descriptions are mostly detailed and pretty decent, And for first edition characters like Strahd, Aisling, and Lord Godfrey, we get a little bit of an update on them. All of the Dark Lords basically I found pretty interesting and was an enjoyable read. However, again, not all the Dark Lords are included, and this was a little frustrating. Now I know the book itself, if it could have been maybe 50 more pages, they might could have included every Dark Lord. But, you know, space being what it was, that's why I was so upset about stuff like the Bloodlines chapter. I just wanted more. It was so good I wanted more. And because I didn't have more, those 3 chapters were the frustrating aspect of this book. So there you go, the Ravenloft core set. A good first start, but not perfected by any means. Besides my gripes about the certain chapters and what feels like a lot of cut content, there are other problems. As you can see, the domain maps. Instead of being a regular type of map, cities and stuff like that, it goes with geography more than anything. Now, this wasn't really too much of a problem for me, but it did frustrate a lot of people. The map format would be changed a few years later in the red box, so they listened at least. The city poster maps are terrible. Instead of your typical city map, is designed in a way where only the streets are visible, so they look like a jumbled mess. The family portraits are nice but virtually useless, and the location cards were not needed as well. Besides, they look like something out of a watercolor painting, as you can see here, and not in a gothic style at all, which very much clashes with the product. Especially the tone of the art inside the interior of the book. And to me, that was a big problem. Now, as much as I love this box set for sentimental reasons, it was the first and deserves a special place in my heart. I can still remember the day I bought it and the euphoria I had reading it. I cannot, however, recommend this product. In 4 years, it was rendered obsolete. The red box would almost verbatim repeat everything in this black box, plus with a bunch of new material and an updated timeline. Really, this set is for only completionists. That's it. Other than that, spend your money on other Ravenloft products, because you're going to need it. And as great as this set was for being first, and as much as I love it, I'm going to have to say pass.